preliminary understanding of what the United Nations is. I think I'm assuming that all of you have, or let's say, have heard about the UN through your class 9, 8 civics notes or social sciences notes. Uh, the reason for the United Nations and the functions of the United Nations have been called into a lot of, or let's say, have been, you know, the essence of the United Nations has always been under a lot of doubt, very recently so. There has been a lot of criticism for the UN as well. But UN in itself is probably the most comprehensive body or the most relevant body when it comes to understanding the international governance and the relation between member states and nations. So it's a very recent body. Uh, Please take note of this slide. This is just a very basic, introduction to what the UN is. So it was founded in 1945. It's the let's say the secondary organization or the organization which followed the erstwhile League of Nations. So the League of Nations was initially the body which looked into the functions of the UN, or let's say the function that the UN looks into, but not that comprehensively as its successor. Okay, so it's mainly concerned with global issues and it has a primary objective of maintaining peace and security, cooperation and healthy relations among its member states. Okay, so it's currently made up of 193 member states. If I'm not very wrong, the most recent addition was the country of South Sudan to the UN. So it's currently made up of 193 member states and membership has only increased over the years. All right. Uh, it was also, the term was coined by the United States President, who was one of the founding fathers of the UN. The Franklin D. Roosevelt was his name. You might also know him. He's a very famous figure for the Second World War. So you might have heard about him as well. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so before we begin with understanding what the UN is, the most important thing that everybody should know, or let's say for anybody who is engaging in an activity which concerns so many people and concerns about billions of people and member states at large, there needs to be a let's say set of rules that need to be followed, a set of guidelines that need to be taken care of. The same is bestowed upon the UN through the UN Charter, which was the founding document of the United Nations. The UN Charter and all of its chapters are very relevant, and it is the backbone and structure that guides the functions of the United Nations at large. Okay, so for somebody who is engaging in an MUN committee, or somebody who is doing an MUN, or for somebody who is just interested in the UN, you should know a little bit about the UN Charter, simply because if you are interested in something, you should know the guidelines which help you better understand the functioning of the same. Okay, so the UN Charter, I'll not be speaking much about it here. We'll speak about it later. Next slide. Okay, so the role of the United Nations now is very, very relevant with respect to fostering global cooperation. And after the wave of globalization that has been a prevalent trend since the end of Second World War, it is the primary organization which acts as a common midpoint for all member states that we know of. Okay, so it deals with a range of issues to which there are multiple organizations as well. The multiple organizations, we'll be discussing them briefly very soon. So basically the UN currently is needed as never before, although its functionality in the ground level might be under a lot of critique lately, or let's say it has been under a lot of critique since the last century, like the last 10-20 years. It still is the only organization which provides a common platform for all member states across the world. So it is probably the most important organization when it comes to global governance, and there is no replacement for it as of now. Next slide. Okay, so the primary question that might be plaguing a lot of you, looking at propaganda pieces, looking at a lot of news articles right now stating how the UN is redundant and there's no need for the UN actually. So the question that bothers a lot of you is, why do we need an organization like the UN? So the answer is very simple, although it is very utopian in nature, but it is very simple. Global challenges do demand global solutions. This is the only place where the world's nations meet. And it is probably and is the only organization. There are multiple bodies under it, but the United Nations at large is the only organization which unites every member state or every country that we know of. Okay, next slide. We have an example here, which is the WFP of the El Salvador regime. This is the World Food Program under the UNFPA, which is the Food and Population Organization and wing of the United Nations. Okay, so this is a basic, the reason why you should be doing an MUN, although you might self-reflect. But if you have ever asked yourself a question as to why you need an organization like the UN, what is the relevance of the UN after the amount of critique it has faced, you should know that at the end of the day, there is no replacement. I have mentioned that previously as well. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so we are now going to move into technicalities. This is where you need to pay a little bit of heed because we have only discussed the introduction and the general stuff at large. But from here on, you can apply this information directly to your model event simulation. Also, as you are, you're engaging this activity with a competitive spirit, I hope. For somebody who is a first timer, you might be just doing it for, let's say, an introduction as to what it is. But at the end of the day, MUN is nothing but a competition that students or individuals engage in. And it's a common platform for people to discuss ideas, well, yes, but you still pay it's quite an amount to participate in it. So you're expecting something from the experience. So I'll ask all of you to pay maximum heed from here on, because it's very important for your understanding of whatever committee you might go to. The structure of the UN is very relevant to your functioning in committee and with respect to how you will do in committee. Okay, so the charter, the UN Charter, has established 6 principal organs of the UN: the GA, the General Assembly; the SC, the Security Council; the ECOSOC, which is also known as the Economic and Social Council; the Trusteeship Council; the 5th organ, which is the International Court of Justice; and the final organ, which is the Secretariat. Okay, so 5 of the 6 principal organs of the UN are based at UN headquarters, but the 6th, the ICJ, is based in Hague, Netherlands. All right. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. It's not important. This part is not important. Okay, so please take note of this. This is a very simple way to understand what the UN system is. You have the Secretariat, the Security Council, the ICJ, and the flowchart will tell you as to what each of these bodies gets subdivided into. Okay, so if you want, you can take a screenshot. If I'm not very wrong, the organizers will be sending across a soft copy of the very PDF that we are presenting here. So you can take note of that there as well. That's pretty comprehensive in itself. But this is basically what the UN system currently looks like. At the very moment, the Trusteeship Council is not, that relevant to the United Nations system. But apart from that, all other 5 of the same is important and required for your understanding of how the current status quo is governed by the UN. All right. Okay. So next slide. All right. So the UN General Assembly is the first principal organ of the United Nations. It's the deliberative assembly of all the UN member states. So there are 6 organs of the United Nations General Assembly. The first 6 organs or 6 committees of the United Nations General Assembly, more correctly put. The 6 subcommittees are the UNGA and DISEC. I think that's there in the next slide. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. So by resolution 47-233, the General Assembly rationalized its main committee structure into 6 separate committees. So the reasoning for this is, as the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations at large deal with so many issues at hand, there's a need for segregation, or let's say distribution of work. So specific committees look into specific issues. So the UNGA has 6 such subcommittees. The first committee is the Disarmament and International Security Committee. The second one is the Economic and Financial Committee, which is a UNGA ECOFIN. The third committee is the Social, Humanitarian and Cultural Committee, which is the UNGA SOCUM. Uh, the fourth committee is the UNGA Special Political and Decolonization Committee, which is the UNGA SPECPOL. The fifth committee is the UN United Nations General Assembly Administrative and Budgetary Committee, the ADBUD, and the sixth committee is the UNGA Legal. Okay, so as the names of each of these committees suggest, these specific committees look into specific functions. We'll not be going into detail because we are not here to understand about what the United Nations General Assembly is. Rather, we are here to understand as to how you should be functioning and preparing yourself for an MEN. Okay, but please keep this in mind. It's good to know, firstly. It's also very important for you to know what organs are, or let's say what are the subcommittees, for you to understand what is the mandate of each committee and the limited scope of work in each committee you go to. So the segregation of functions is primarily important for the same. All right. Next slide. Okay. So the second principal organ of the UN is the UN Security Council. It's the executive body of the United Nations. It looks into international security issues, and its headquarters is in New York as well. So it has 15 members, 5 permanent members, the P5, along with other members, which the membership of which gets rotated around on a monthly basis. So there's a specific, let's say, consideration that is given to the 5 members, or the 5 permanent members of the UNSC, which is known as a veto power. I think all of you here are aware of what the veto power is. It's the power of saying no to any resolution which is tabled, or let's say which is voted upon. And if any of the permanent members of the UNSC say no, that means that UNSC resolution stands cancelled, or it then gets converted into an L document, which is it's basically a document which is kept for administrative purposes, but it cannot be acted upon. Okay, so there are probably more L documents than actual UNSC resolutions. There are probably 4 folds or 5 folds of more UNSC L documents rather than UNSC resolutions. So that's primarily also the reason why the UNSC has faced a lot of critique and a lot of there's been a lot of talk of reforming the UNSC, but to this end and to this day, the status quo currently is that 5 permanent members have the power to veto any resolution which gets discussed or tabled for passing in the UNSC. Okay, so it's the executive body of the UN United Nations and the second principal organ. Okay, next slide, please. So before we move on to the ECOSOC, which is Economic and Social Council, the 5 permanent members of the UNSC, they were formed, or let's say they were given the permanent membership to the UNSC simply because of the geopolitical advantage, or let's say the amount of, if not economic, but the amount of, let's say, power they garnered with respect to the geopolitical situation surrounding the time, at that point in time when it was made. I'm not exactly being able to recall when the veto power was administered, but it was somewhere around 1945 or 46. So that is where the consideration for the veto power also comes into a lot of critique with respect to, there are a lot of countries who argue that why is France being ordained the power to veto any resolution. There are much better, or let's say much more rather suited countries. Also, there's a lot of talk about how the European region gets represented. It gets represented twice, wherein the Americas, the Asian region, as well as Russia is separate in itself. They only get represented once. So that is how the veto power came into play. The 5 permanent members are the United States of America, China, United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Okay. So we'll now move on to the Economic and Social Council, which is for global economic and social affairs, that as the name gives itself. So the UN ECOSOC also has limited membership. It's not like the General Assembly where all member states can sit and deliberate on issues. It has a rotation-based, membership, which is of 54 members. The General Assembly selects, let's say, elects these members on a rotation basis, to serve staggered 3-year mandates. Okay, so that's the ECOS hub. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so this is the fourth organ, principal organ of the United Nations, the UN Trusteeship Council. Although it's not quite, relevant for our functioning in the current day and age, but the historical functioning of the UN Trusteeship Council is very important for your understanding of how international governance has worked since post-World War or since the inception of the UN. Okay, so UN Trusteeship Council was basically established on the idea that the colonial territories, so colonialism which existed before the Second World War, was to ensure that the countries or the colonial territories would be, the transfer of power would be such that the native powers could regain the onus of power and form a government of their own. So the Trusteeship Council has suspended its operations since the 1st of November 1994 after the independence of Palau, which was the last remaining United Nations trust territory. Okay, so trust territories and how the shift of power has come into play and how that can be administered. The case studies of the same is actually very important as to understand how current global issues can also be solved with respect to how a mechanism of trust or a trust country under supervision of the same native government until the same power was administered is important for your understanding as to, although it's not relevant or it cannot be directly applied to any situation currently, but it's important to realize that there can be a global platform where issues as sensitive as this can be discussed and action can be taken on the same. All right. Okay, next slide. Okay, the fifth principal organ and the only organ which is not there in the compound in New York, the UN compound in New York, is the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice. This is located in the Hague, Netherlands. It's one of, I have a bucket list to go visit the ICJ once, at least in my life, and I'm hopeful that I might get the chance to very soon. So basically, the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. For all of you who have studied history and civics in your 10th, 9th, you know that the Indian, and I'm assuming that all of you are Indian nationals here and have studied here in India. If you have studied history and civics and if you have studied social sciences, you will know that the in the Indian Parliament and the Indian government has a lot of organs as well. So the Indian executive and the Indian judiciary are separate organs. Similarly, the United Nations also requires a separate organ to look into judicial issues. Okay, the court is composed of 15 judges who are also elected by the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. It is assisted by registry, which is its administrative organ. So the ICJ also requires an administrative organ, and there are multiple registrars put into place who look into the governance of the ICJ as well. Okay. All right. Next slide. And finally, the UN Secretariat, which is the administrative organ of the UN, and what the organizers here will be simulating in a way. So you have the UN Secretariat and then you have the MUN Secretariat. Current UN Secgen is Antonio Guterres, and these individuals are basically the hosts as well as the individuals who look into the entire administration of the United Nations. Okay, although it might seem like they are only the hosts, but the UN Secretariat in itself has also a lot of discretionary measures as to how it can act in separate regions. Okay, so the functioning of the UN Secretariat is very important for your understanding. It's quite frankly overlooked when you are looking at the United Nations from a model UN perspective. But the functioning of the UN Secretariat is also very important when you're trying to understand what the UN is. Okay, we'll not go into the detail regarding this. We'll move on. Next slide. Okay, so we'll now talk about more interesting part. What MUNs are. I'll be very frank here, although this might sound a little bit, wrong for the organizers present here, but I prefer to not take online orientation sessions or workshops for that matter, simply because I can't see you guys who are attending the session and I can't interact with you. So the primary reason as to why I started doing MUNs and why I encourage people to do MUNs is because it gives you a common platform to ensure that you meet people who are, if not no, like-minded. You meet people who are equally interested to participate in an exercise that you do as well. Okay, so that common ground of meeting people and connecting and networking is very important for your later lives, and that should be one of the primary reasons as to why you engage in this exercise if you choose to continue to do it. Okay, so having said that, the reason as to why you should be MUNing, I try to imbibe that in the workshops I conduct as well by having brief interaction sessions and exercises with you guys, but it's not possible in the online mode. So there's no two ways about it. But for anybody who is participating in G20, be prepared. There will be a lot of sessions like this where we as executive board members will be participating in the debate as well, and we'll be ensuring that there's a two-way, let's say, sort of communication that happens in the committee. Okay. All right. So what is an MUN? A model UN is basically an academic simulation of the United Nations, but uh, where students also play the role of delegates from different countries. I did my first MUN not for an academic purpose, but for primarily because I wanted to dress up good and take good pictures of myself. This was way back in 2016. I did nothing in my first MA. So if you're not doing for an academic purpose, it's all right. But if you continue to do it not for an academic purpose, then it becomes an issue. Okay. So if it's your first time, be cool, be chill. It's not something, and it's just an exercise that you're trying out. But if you like doing it, which I did back in the day, I continued doing it and I started looking at it in a very very academic standpoint and understanding how this can help me in my future as well, and it has. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so the primary reason for being here is to understand how you can MUN and how you can do better in an MUN. All right, so we will be taking this entire exercise, or let's say the entire workshop, through a very simple exercise. We'll be taking a real example as to how you can deliberate and delegate in a model UN simulation with the example of one committee, which is UNJ dissect, and we'll be taking the example of one agenda, and we'll be taking the allotment of Iran here. Okay, so you have UNJ dissect in GMUN IIT KGP as well. For anybody who is doing UNJ dissect, I'm not the executive board member of UNJ dissect, so I wouldn't know what your agenda is, but you can try and understand. And for anybody else who is doing any other committee, this can serve as a very good means as to understand how you can do your committee. This can serve as a module for you to implement your understanding of how you can approach this committee and do well here. Okay. So all of the committees that you are going to in this simulation, all of them have an agenda, and all of you by this time, I hope you have received an allotment so you can start your research. Okay. So this is what we'll be doing now. All right. Let's move on. Next slide. Okay, so before anything else, you need to understand the committee that you are in, or the committee that you are going to participate in. Okay, so the UNJ dissect, and the reasoning as to why I've taken this example is because almost all Model UN conferences have this committee uh, as one of its simulated committees, simply because it's a very beginner friendly committee, and it's also the first uh, subcommittee of the United Nations General Assembly, which is the first principal organ of the United Nations. So there are a lot of tips, like I've highlighted. There are two tips that you can know of about the UNJ dissect. It is usually very important, firstly, to know about the various intricacies or the working format of any committee you're going to. Here you have the example of dissect. The second, or let's say the most important tip according to me, if you ask me or if you ask anybody else who is giving you sound advice, it's the best starting point for you to start your research is to firstly understand the mandate or the scope of discussion your committee provides. Okay, so it's usually important for you to understand the mandate, only because you don't want to overlap or discuss something which is not even relevant to the committee that you are in. Okay, so it's important that you know the mandate of the committee, and it can serve as a very good starting point for your research as well. All right, next slide please. Okay, so We have taken the example of UNJ dissect for the people who are doing ANJ dissect. This can help you a lot. So I have explored the example of UNJ dissect, and there are 7 thematic paths under which the mandate of the UNJ dissect can be divided. For anybody who is doing UNHRC, for anybody who is doing G20, for anybody who is doing UNSC, you can also look at your committee. It's a simple Google search away. Just look at what your committee does and try and have a bulleted set of points like I have made for the UNJ dissect along with you, so that you know what can be discussed in the committee and what cannot be discussed in the committee. Okay. So the 7 thematic paths include, as all of you can read, I hope everybody is being able to read. So I'll not be reading the 7 points, but I'm here to try and make you understand that this is how you approach and how you know take up the exercise and provide a sort of starting point for you to take up your research and start engaging in model UN conferences in a much better way. Okay, so I'll be just be reading the tips. So here I want the primary thing to remember is it's important that you understand that with regards to its functions, every member of the United Nations, it takes the role of recommendatory body and calls to the Security Council to act upon its recommendations. So it's a recommendation body. Apart from the UNSC, if you're doing UNSC, it's the only executive body of the United Nations. Any other organization of the United Nations is a recommendatory body and it calls for the Security Council to act upon its recommendation. Okay. So there are various technicalities as to how this happens. It's not really relevant, but you need to know that whatever you might be discussing and whatever your end solution might be, at the end of the day, you are just providing a set of recommendation points to the UNSC at large. Okay. All right. Next point. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the UNJ dissect, after you have understood the mandate of your committee and after you have realized what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed in a committee, it's important for you to realize the working structure of your committee. Now, what do I mean by the working structure? The working structure simply means that how your committee functions in the real time, how your committee takes up any sort of issue, any sort of discussion, how it implements the understanding, or let's say the understanding, and how it implements a discussion that is being done and allows for a solution based approach at the end of the day. Okay, so like the slide mentions, the UNJ dissect has further 2 bodies that report to it and work in close cooperation: the United Nations Disarmament Commission as well as the Conference of Disarmament. Okay, so while you're researching, read up on the reports of the various sub bodies of the committee that you partake in. Almost all committees that are being simulated in this very simulation of the global MUN in IIT KGP, all of them have sub bodies. It's important for every committee to have a subcommittee because then it segregates the order of business, or let's say the responsibilities between these very subcommittees for better understanding and much faster action than all. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So the mandate, functions, and working structure of any committee from one perspective defines the scope of debate here. So this is your starting point. You first understood what your scope of debate is. So this is where you start, and then you move on to the second part of realizing what to do in MUN. Okay. Next slide. Yes. So the second part that you need to do when you are doing, or let's say engaging in an MUN, is to firstly simplify the agenda. Sometimes agendas are very complex to understand, so it's important for you to break up the agenda into parts so that it provides a better understanding for all of you who are doing an MUN. So this is your analysis and your own. As an individual, this is where you break it down personally and try to understand the agenda at large and ensure that whatever you're understanding, you're able to comprehend and explain it in simple words. Okay. So the agenda, or the example of the agenda that we took, was the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Firstly, the first question that you should be asking yourself is, what is non-proliferation? Second, what are nuclear weapons? And after you have understood both of these terms, the third question is your analysis of understanding the agenda. Now, non-proliferation means the prevention or increase or spread of something. Nuclear weapons, all of you know, is a bomb or missile that uses nuclear energy to cause an explosion. Now, this is where an analysis comes in, and this is the first step of your analysis as to what is the need or why even should we discuss this. So that is where you ask yourself that question and you read up as to why it is needed. Okay, like I mentioned here, nuclear weapons obviously need to be banned because they have unacceptable humanitarian consequences. But there are a lot of arguments against it as well as to how it poses a very imminent threat to security if you don't have nuclear weapons. All right. Next slide. Yeah. So the next slide tells you about a very important aspect of your research and how you are approaching the debate at large. It's a set of things that you need to know before you sit in an MUN and go to a committee on day one, which are a set of frameworks, a set of regulations that are already present. These primarily can be international treaties, they can be regional agreements, it can even be your national policy. And at the end of the day, the most important one for an MUN is it can also be an UN resolution. Okay, so these four things, like I've mentioned here in the example, these four, these four set of resources is very important for your committee and how you argue in committee and how good your points are. Okay, so international treaties, regional agreements, national policy, and UN resolutions usually take care of everything that you need to know about the agenda at hand. Okay, next slide. Okay, now the most interesting part or the reason as to how, or let's say the way you are going to talk to or interact in an MUN is through a speech. Okay, I have taken the example and made a speech of my own. This is how I delegate in committees. So you can take this as an example and try and utilize this as a framework for making your own speeches as well. Okay. I want all of you to pay maximum heed to the tip mentioned in this slide, which is the fact that the X factor in a good delegate is revealed to the quality, not the quantity of statements made. Okay. So the quality of your speech needs to be much better than the quantity of your speeches. Okay. I have seen and I have delegated against many delegates who have only spoken twice or thrice in the entire committee session, and they still have bagged a higher award than I have. Okay, and I've seen, and let's say, uh, you know, I have chaired a lot of delegates who have been good in this very regard as well. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. So it's important for you to realize this that even though at some point in time, especially if you're a beginner or just starting out, it might seem like that the number of speeches being made is important for your performance in committee. It can be if your executive board is not understanding what you're saying, but if the executive board is sound and fair and logical, they will be factoring in the quality of your speeches much more than the quantity of the speeches that you give. Okay. So there are pointers for framing your speeches. These are the pointers that I use. I try to focus on one idea per speech. I try to use a relevant framework. I try to persuade the global community or the participants, the fellow participants that are participating in the MUN, that this is the idea that I am presenting. This is why it should be the only way you understand this idea which I'm presenting. Okay, so it's about persuading people, it's about negotiating, and that is the reason why you should not only be describing but telling your side of the story, your analysis of it, and ensuring that your analysis of the story is the most correct version of the understanding that everybody else has. Okay, followed by foreign policy and national interest, as the name suggests. Foreign policy and national interest need to be mentioned in an MUN because you're representing a country, you're not representing yourself. I mean, I can talk about Rupaz's interests as well, but in this very simulation on the very idea of an MUN is for you to take, or let's say role play as a delegate or a diplomat representing the needs of a billion or more than millions of people, depending on which country you choose to delegate as. So it's important that you understand what your national interests and what your foreign policy dictates. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we'll take a subtopic here. So the agenda that I took as an example was the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. The subtopic as an example for which I have written a speech will be the nuclear weapons free zone, okay, or the NWFZ. Again, maximum heed for the tips. Actually, I'll tell you something here. It's more important for you to take note of the tips rather than if you're taking a physical or digital note, because I think this will be made available to you after the presentation, but try to understand as to why these tips have been given. I've given them for a certain reason. Uh, the reasoning as to why you should be taking physical or digital notes at large is because you need to understand what your other delegates are saying in the committee. And it's important that you realize here that whatever you are saying in committee or speaking about in committee needs to be easily comprehensible for everybody else in committee. You give me 10 technical jargons that nobody understands. At the end of the day, you might have a doctorate in political science and you might be able to, uh, understand what of all the 10 jargons that you've spoken about. But you need to also understand that a lot of us are not that intellectually capable for doing the same. So it's important for you, as somebody who is engaging in an MUN, which is a college level or a school level competition, that whatever you're saying makes sense to yourself and everybody around you. Okay, so try and take note of everybody else's speech so that you're able to, in the way, talk about and speak about the same, building on it, and try to ensure that you are always attentive in committee because it helps a lot. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a speech. I'll not be reading out the speech, but this is basically what a model speech looks like. This is one of the better speeches that I've ever made in an MA. This is a personal speech of mine that I gave in an actual simulation. So this is an example that you can take note of. You will notice that in this speech, there has been only a focus on one idea, which is the establishment of a nuclear weapon free zone, especially in the Middle East region. Here we've also tried to, as is the Iranian perspective on this entire issue, we have mentioned that the policy of Israel towards the NPT and NWFZ in the Middle East region stands as a hindrance towards the fulfillment of the goals of the international community to establish such a road zone in the region. So you understand as to how we are persuading everybody else here that the problem here is Israel, not Iran. That is what you need to do. Okay. Now, your foreign policy and your national interest will dictate as to how you pursue it. So it's important you take cognizance of the same and you ensure that how you speak also reflects on the same as to how you're passionate about the entire topic at large. Okay. So this is a model speech. You can take a screenshot if you wish to and use this as an example. All right. Give me a while. All right. All right, so apologies for the delay. We'll now move on to the next slide. I hope that all of you have been able to understand the speech part of things. Now, something that is very important to keep in mind, at the end of the day, all of you will be having a limit of time per speech. It's important for the limit to be placed simply because a lot of delegates tend to go a little bit too overboard on the amount of passion that they deliver on. So that's why there's usually a limit kept, and the limit is kept equal for all, so that everybody gets an equal footing and equal amount of time to present themselves. Okay, so the limit usually is around 90 seconds for your general speakers list or for your formal debate, and around 60 to 75 seconds for your informal speech. Hardly have I seen, especially for smaller committees, maybe the time limit can be kept at 120 seconds, but usually this is not the case. Okay. Uh, Also, another very important thing to keep in mind is to allowing questions after your speech. If let's say you are, in a formal part of the debate where there can be questions raised on your speech, ensure that you allow the questions, okay? Because your understanding of an issue can be best demonstrated only when you're being able to understand and respond immediately. Okay. Otherwise, the executive board, the people who are judging you, will not get an idea. So that gives you an edge over the others. That is not the only idea that the executive board needs to know about, but it adds an edge. When you are aware of any sort of question that can be asked and are ready with your answer, that gives you a certain sort of edge over the other delegates who might be present in the committee. Okay, so this only comes with experience. It's obviously not going to happen for everybody in the first MUN that they do, but try to build this confidence as you are doing day one followed by day two of the first MUN that you're going to. Okay, so try to not jump from one topic to another. This is a personal advice of mine. I try to focus on one topic at a time, and that's why I'm asking you to do as well. Because at any point in time, practically speaking, in a time limit of around 90, 100 seconds or 60 seconds as well, you can only focus on one idea and discuss it in detail for everybody else to understand. Okay. All right. Thank you. So the tip here is very important. Speeches need to be very credible, and they only become credible when you are also mentioning certain, important things that you know support the argument that you're making. These can be even resolutions, they can be country reports, they can be international reports of organizations that are recognized by the UN as well. Okay, so try and take note of this. We'll be talking about your ways to research and how you can approach research uh, in a while, and that shall clear things out a lot better for you as to how you can approach your research in committee. Okay, all right. Organizers, before we move on, can the setting be reversed wherein the participants can ask questions at this point in time?
Okay, I think they can just raise their hands if anybody has any
Okay,
question. I can give them, yeah.
you can unmute them, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. So I'll be taking questions now because we are in sort of like a. Rishika, can I just turn off your mic?
So
Hello.
anybody of you guys, if you have any questions, you could just raise your hand.
Yeah, Rishika, can you just turn your mic off? I think that's a issue. Yeah, just unmute them. I'll be taking note of this. Okay, so we have Gokul Vinayak here. Gokul, please ask a question. Rishika, if you can just unmute them. I think I can unmute them, right? No, I can't. Please unmute them. Yeah, Gokul, please tell me.
Okay, sir. Yeah, I am doing it for the first time, and I am allotted in G20. So, can you tell me something more about G20 specifically?
Um, Something about G20. This question is better suited at day one of committee when we meet. If you have any doubts with respect to whatever has been discussed as of yet, it's rather suited that you ask that. Okay, so do not worry. I'll be meeting you for two consecutive days on Saturday and Sunday. Any questions that you might have will be clarified on day one itself. We'll be having another separate session for G20, understanding what the G20 is and its rules of procedure before we begin committee discussion. So do not worry about your committee experience in G20 as of now. Try to have cognizance as to how you can employ your understanding of, or let's say how you can approach debate in G20 with the example that I mentioned. Okay. All right.
Okay,
Next question.
thanks.
Divyansh, if I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I missed the speech part wherein you were explaining about how we should write our own speech or how we should represent our speech. Could you just explain it in a brief once again?
Okay, fair, fair. Rishika, can we just go back to? I think I can control the slides as well. Okay, but Rishika, you don't need to take care of this. I am being able to control slides. Apologies for this. I am not really used to the interface of Microsoft Teams. I usually take meetings on Google Meet, so I'm a little bit sort of like dusty on this. But I'll be able to control the flow of slides, so you don't need to take care of it. Just keep unmuting people if they have a question. Okay. Thank you. So, all right, Divyansh, to answer your question, this is the model speech that you can take a screenshot of if you wish to. But the idea of making a speech, or let's say the uh, also when I'm changing slides, all of you are being able to see the change, right? I hope that's visible. I mean, I'm currently at the example subtopic nuclear weapons free zone, right? Okay, so I'm seeing your reactions, thumbs up. Okay, thank you guys. So this speech is the very framework that I discussed with respect to focusing on one idea, trying to persuade individuals, and then reaffirming your idea with argumentation that ensures that you are in a global, global parity wise, you are explaining your idea in a global context is what can be done. This is a model speech that I have drafted on my own. You don't need to take this as your Bible for making speeches. The speech could have been made much better. But at the end of the day, the idea of making a speech should be that you are being able to make your point across the room. The person who is not even trying to understand, that person should also be able to understand what you're trying to speak of. Okay. So the idea should be very lucid. It should be presented very lucidly. Your delivery does come into play, although it's very secondary. If your content is good and your delivery is average or even below average, the idea of it is very comprehensive and it's very easy to understand. So this example is one such example where the NWFZ and the NPT and Israel's action as Iran has been discussed. You can see that only one idea as to the policy level actions of Israel have been discussed. This is an example of a GSL. So I have not gone into specific policy demarcations as such, but there needs to be an idea wherein you focus on one idea per speech. If I move to the next slide. Okay, so I cannot turn. Okay, sorry. So Rishika, yeah, thank you. All right. Okay, so that's about it. Again, as the tip mentions, try to relate your speech to relevant international frameworks, resolutions per se. UN resolutions are the most important resolutions that you can look forward to or look at when you're making a speech, and try to provide a backing for your arguments in committee. Okay. All right. We'll take another question. Divyansh, I hope that was understandable and clear. Yeah, go ahead,
Hi.
Anshul Neil.
Hello.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Typically,
please.
how do you go about deciding how long you have to prepare your speeches? Like over here, it says 60, 90, 120 seconds, but overall, I mean, on the day of the session itself, you'll probably get to know, right, how much we get to speak, like on certain topics and all. So typically, how do we plan out how much material we prepare?
So the
By that, I
idea
mean
that I try
duration.
to, okay, yeah. So I've understood your question. The idea that I try to do that as a, as a sort of cautionary method that I try to imbibe is whenever I'm preparing for any sort of time, I try to offset around 15 seconds and reduce those 15 seconds when I'm preparing myself. Okay. So if you are preparing for 60 seconds, uh, when I am preparing for 60 seconds, I usually try to keep my speeches within 45 seconds when I'm practicing. The way to do this is via practice, via timing yourself. Coming to your question as to how you will know uh, how long your speeches will be, it's not really that important. You have groups as well that are usually made nowadays for MN conferences before the committee, that you can discuss these technicalities at large, as to how much time you need for your speech, or the specific time requirements for specific speeches, right? For your GSL, you might allot a higher amount of time than you might allot for the informal part of the debate. That can be a moderated caucus, that can be a formal informal session. So that understanding needs to be done within the participants in the group. That's simply a logistical thing. But at the end of the day, you should know that your content needs to be structured in a way where if you are asked to speak for 60 seconds on a speech that you had prepared for 90 seconds, you're still being able to do it. The way you can do that is by understanding what your speech tries to imbibe. And when you have understood what your speech is trying to imbibe, if you have understood that very content that you're trying to deliver in a very lucid manner, in a way you can explain it to others without even looking or referring the material that you have, the idea of it can still be propagated in 60 seconds. Okay, so that's why, although it might not be made clear to you, but at the end of the day, it's the only thing that matters is having a content structure and having a content in a manner where you know that these are my focus points and these are the secondary points that even if I don't mention, I'm still making my idea clear. Okay, so it's basically prioritizing and ensuring that the most important points get represented first. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we have only one question left from Kushal.
Can I ask the organizers if I could change my committee? Because the one I've been allotted right now is not the one that I filled in the preference form.
Kushal, I think this is not, I think a better forum to ask them would be via DM or via email. You can do that, you can reach out to them, organizing committee members, please look into this. If this is an issue that you wish to, if you do
Yeah,
not
we'll
have a
look into
question,
this. Yeah.
yeah, if you do not have a question with respect to what has been discussed as of yet, I think we can move on, if that is cool with you. All right?
You
All
could
right.
please reach out to us via DM or email. We'll look into it.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So seeing that there are no more questions left, we'll straight away move on to the next part of the presentation. Rishika, can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. So this is where you learn how to research. We have taken the example of one speech and I've tried to make you understand as to how you can approach your drafting of a speech, the idea of using set framework for writing your speech. But before you write your speech, you need to research, right? So you cannot, just keep writing speeches because for any point in time, even if you're a very seasoned MUNers, even if you have done 500 MUNs, at one point in time, if you're discussing something, given the current status quo and given the temporal aspect of issues, which is the time aspect of issues and how they're temporary, you need to research. Okay. So for anybody who tells you that they don't research anymore simply because they have done 200 MUNs, it's not what they do. They do research, and even if they are not researching and still winning, then there's some problem in the system. Okay, so this is how you research. There are 4 sub parts as to researching in an MN conference. As this is how I understand it. You first have unbiased research, which is the research that you do before you take your allotment and committee into cognizance. Then you move into your committee specific research. Then you move into your country specific research, followed by bias research. Okay. Now there are specific reasons as to why these have been segregated. We'll discuss this as we move on. Okay. We'll move on to unbiased research. Next slide, please. Okay. So for anybody who is starting off with research, unbiased research is the first step you'll be taking, where you have absolutely no idea as to what the agenda is and what it, talks about. Okay. So at this stage, you have no clue or very little idea about the agenda. This is the most important stage of your research because you have to comprehend the agenda without adding any further layers to it. Okay. Start reading credible online articles. You can even refer to Wikipedia. A lot of people will discourage you from reading Wikipedia, but I am not somebody who lives by this idea. I have always, looked at Wikipedia in this manner. Wikipedia is an open source platform. It is made to store information in a very lucid manner so that anybody who uses Wikipedia is able to understand what the content is. So the tip here is to not read the Wikipedia pages religiously. Just take a quick glance through it. Just give it one reading. Don't ever quote anything that you read on Wikipedia in committee. Okay. Wikipedia might be telling you that country X has committed 2,000 war crimes against country Y. If you quote that in committee and if you tell me in committee that your source is Wikipedia, I will ask you who made that edit in Wikipedia. Okay. So as this is an open source platform, random user 2046 might just be writing that in Wikipedia, and although there are multiple mechanisms currently in Wikipedia to ensure that that does not happen, but the peer review mechanism of the Wikipedia website is the reason why we don't refer anything from Wikipedia in committee. Okay, but to understand and to gain an initial understanding of a specific agenda, it's very easy to look at Wikipedia and do the same. So my encouragement would be to always look at Wikipedia initially or any sort of other website that allows you to understand very easily. Did we lose Rishika? Rishika, I think your screen has disappeared. Hello.
Just give me a minute. One
Yeah,
second.
no worries. No worries. No worries. Are we facing technical issues? I can present as well. If that's the case, I can
Yeah,
start
actually, I'm
presenting.
just trying to share the PPT. It's not being uploaded.
Okay, I'll try and share my screen. If in the meanwhile you're able to figure it out, do present it because
Okay.
just give me a while. I hope it's visible. Hello. Is my screen visible? Oh, it's not.
No.
Wait. Yeah, it's visible now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were at unbiased research. We'll now move on to committee specific research. Yeah. So we'll move on to committee specific research. This is where you start segregating your research. Okay. Unbiased research, you've gained an understanding of the agenda item at large. You've gained a very basic understanding of the same. You have tried to comprehend it in your own words without adding any further layers to it. Now you straight away start your committee specific research. Okay. This is where you accustom yourself with the reality of the situation which plagues you. All right. Past meetings, past reports of any committee that you're going to is a very great way to begin with the committee specific research. You can also refer to previous resolutions passed by the committee, previous documents passed by the committee if the committee does not have the mechanism to make a resolution. The committee will, in some way or the other, be informing the global parity as to what has been discussed in the committee. So even if it's a press release, it's important that you look at the past documentation or the past information as to what your committee has discussed in the real time. All right. So it's important for you to ensure that you go through this. This is a hyperlinked tip. If you are being given the PDF, ensure that you bookmark this link. I think you can see my cursor, right? So this is the United Nations library, which is a DAG Hammarskjöld library, which serves as the basis, or let's say the encyclopedia of everything related to the United Nations and all the documents it has made. It's very easy to operate if all of you are, I'm assuming that all of you are much better technically equipped than I am. So I am able to operate this website. So that gives me an idea that everybody else can. All right. So the United Nations Library will be a very good and comprehensive starting point for your committee specific research. Although this might seem very daunting at first looking at the amount of material that is there, but it is important for you to start reading, because if you're not reading, you'll not be able to understand, and if you're not able to understand, you'll not be able to do good in the committee. So the UN organization and the library is the primary website that you should be looking at to start off your committee specific research. Okay. Moving on, we'll now move on to. All right, so there's some technical reason the country specific research slide is not here, but as bias research and country specific research almost coincide, uh, we'll speak about country specific and bias research here itself. So now that you know what you're dealing with, you have understood what your committee has discussed on this issue or issues on these lines in the past, what your committee can do and cannot do. This is where you start understanding what your country or your allotment can do, or what your country or allotment has done in the past and how it is dealing with it currently. All right. So this is where you start analyzing the situation not through your own lens, through the lens of the country you're representing. Okay. So understanding the same, you need to ensure that the foreign policy that you're presenting or the national stance that you're presenting should not be a direct tangent or very immediate tangent to what has been your country's policies in the past in the real time. It can be a sort of a tangent, a little bit of a tangent if you want, but you need to back it up with your understanding of the issue and as to why this tangent has been the case now. Okay, I've seen some of my role models in MUNs. They have actually, I have learned from these people. They have at times deviated from what the country's stance is in the real time, but they have been able to back it up with solid argumentation as to why they are taking this step. And the only reason why they have been able to do this is because they've understood the issue at large and they've analyzed it in the simple own terms so that they're able to comprehend it and act on it and alter the course if needed, knowing its repercussions and addressing those repercussions in a manner where they're being able to provide a comprehensive outline as to how this new set of approach can be implemented. That is the maximum you can do. And that is why bias research is important. Your analysis is the most important aspect of your research. Okay. So when you are researching, just do not look at statistics, go on looking about numbers, look at this number of resolutions and try and not understand as to why. It's not about the what, it's about why, who, where. Okay. These three questions need to be taken care of before you know what you are talking about, and you'll get to know about why and where and how this very issue is being discussed. Okay, so the resources, as I mentioned previously, this can be meeting records, previous statements of the UN, relevant documentation by your country. If you are taking up countries which are very, technically well equipped, you will be finding a lot of important documents on their website itself. But even if you are not, it's not an issue at all. Meeting records, previous statements in the UN form a very good understanding of it. Okay. The reason why I have kept this slide, this entire slide, and only one slide for this is because I want to take complete note of this. This note is the most important part of your experience in a model UN. This understanding is very important that research is an integrated process. Every single step will complement the other. Now, if your unbiased research is weak, your biased research can never be good. Because if you are not understanding the issue at hand from a neutral perspective, you will never be able to argue for or against it. To me, a good delegate is the delegate who can even argue against the statement that they have made, because they have analyzed the situation such, let's say, analyzed their stance about it so well that they have also come up with counter arguments that they believe cannot be answered. Okay, so it's a very comprehensive, and it's something which is very inward for that matter. There's a lot of self-reflection that needs to be done as well. All right. So please take note of this. Please ensure that you are not skipping any part of your research step. Okay. I'll not talk about this part. I believe you can only know why MUNs are good only after you have done an MUN. So hopefully we'll be able to give you an experience like that. Okay. So although I have mentioned rules of procedure in this very meeting, I'll not be going into a detailed analysis of the UNA USA format, simply because you will have committee specific rules of procedure which will be followed. For that matter, taking the example of my committee in G20, we will not be simulating the UNA USA ROP. We will be simulating a separate ROP which is known as the UN Forman ROP. Okay, so I think the onus is better. It's better. It's more consequential and more easily comprehensible for you if you understand the rules of procedure and technicalities of it by or through your executive board themselves. For anybody who is doing G20, I'm not aware of the other committees. We will be discussing the UN Forman ROP in detail on day one itself. So you do not need to worry. But I'll be still be going on, let's say, discussing the basic structure as to how the rules of procedure functions, as to how your flow of, or let's say the order of business in an MAN is. And that should be easy enough for you to comprehend any sort of technicality surrounding the specific ROP which is being followed in your committee. Okay, so we'll not be explaining the UNAS ROP in detail, but I'll be giving you the basic structure that is common for all the ROPs which are being simulated in this edition of GMUN. Okay, all right. So the reason as to why you have a ROP is because at the end of the day, your discussion needs to happen in a structured manner. You cannot have 200 people speaking at once. The Indian Parliament is a very good example as to why the rules of procedure is very important and why adherence to the ROP is very important. Although students here are much better examples of good diplomats and good parliamentarians in model events rather than our actual people who we have actually elected to be present. Let's take the example of the current scenario as well in Indian Parliament. You should be knowing of it. Okay, so the reasoning as to why you have an ROP is because if you do not have a set of rules which guides your committee, there's no way fruitful discussion can ever happen in your committee, because everybody will start speaking at once, because that's what human nature is. And we have to ensure that there is specific amount of time given to everybody and that time is equal for all. So that's the entire reasoning as to why you have an ROP. It's like a set of rules that govern anything for that matter. Okay, so what can you expect during a conference in a model UN? You have the opening ceremony, followed by the beginning and committee and debating sessions, and followed by the closing ceremony, which is to a lot of you the most important part of the event, the closing ceremony. All right. So we'll move on to the structure of the debate. All right. So I'll be explaining this. I'll not be reading out the terms here because they change from ROP to ROP, or for the version of the ROP that is being simulated, but the structure almost remains the same. Okay, so you start off with your roll call, which is your attendance in the committee. The fact that you're present in the committee is ascertained via your roll call. The fact that you're here for this model UN simulation is also ascertained accordingly, followed by the formal part of the debate, which can be a GSL in the UN-USA ROP, or the general speakers list in the UN-USA ROP, or the formal session in the UN Forman ROP. This then gets divided into, or let's say the order of business gets divided into the informal aspect of the debate, which can be done through a moderated caucus and moderated caucus to the UN-USA ROP, or formal, informal of the UN Forman ROP. So basically, the understanding that I want all of you here to have of the ROP is this. In your general speakers list or your formal session, whatever you might call it, this is where the agenda at hand gets discussed at large. Okay, so the general understanding of the agenda in itself. So here your topic of discussion is your entire agenda. But you need to realize at the end of the day, any sort of geopolitical issue is very layered, and there are a lot of layers to the issue which is being discussed. So then is a primary need to discuss the subtopics at large for your better understanding of the issue and for you to have a more comprehensive solution. So the reason for having the informal part of the debate, as you can see these two arrows which get divided, the informal aspect of the debate, the moderated caucus or the formal informal session, whatever you might call it, is to discuss these subtopics. Okay, the moderated caucus or the formal informal session is the place where you discuss a technical subparts of the agenda at hand, and then you are better informed of these subparts, and hence it ensures the fact that you can come to a more comprehensive solution. Okay, and unmod is basically an unmoderated session where you can lobby and talk amongst yourselves and get a better understanding as to how you can move forward in committee. Okay, so this leads to closure of debate followed by whatever voting procedure that you might be implementing. So at this point in time, I will not be discussing points. I will not be discussing motions. I will not be discussing caucuses. I'll not be even discussing draft resolutions. Okay. I'll end my presentation here. But at this point in time, I would want you guys to know that whatever I have told you here today, it's important for your logical understanding as to how you approach an MUN. We'll take questions after I'm done. Just give me a while. The rules of procedure is nothing but a set of rules which will help you function in committee. And like I mentioned, it's probably best suited that your executive board, respective executive board for whichever committee you're going to, explains it to you. Okay. So whichever version of the rules of procedure you might be following, I hope they will be explained to you in detail by your respective executive board. I will not be explaining it to you because there are separate versions of the ROP which will need to be followed in separate committees. All right. So that is the differentiating point. But the common points that I have touched upon today is the approach you take for an MUN, is the approach you take for any committee you can go to, and that is a generalized approach. And that's the only reason why I've discussed it, even because if I'm going to tell you something which will lead you, you know, in a different tangent or in a different direction as to what your executive board is expecting from you in committee, I think that will not be a good experience for you. So technicality surrounding rules of procedure, the type of documentation that you might do, draft resolution or whatever document that you might be making, that is up to your executive board, okay, respective executive board. For G20, we might at the end of the day not have a document at all. So, it depends on the committee you are going to, and the type of rules of procedure which are being discussed is also very dependent on the type of committee you're going to, okay. So any questions surrounding the rules of procedure, they are best suited. Again, I'm repeating this simply because it is important for you to understand that the rules of procedure is not really important. The most important thing for you to begin off your research is your understanding and approach towards the committee. Okay, and that is something that I've tried to talk to you and tell you about. I hope I have been able to do the same. I hope I have been able to provide some sort of clarity to the situation. I'm going to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please do ask. Before that, I congratulate every single one of you for taking the onus to be at least here, or even if, firstly, congratulations to you for signing up for an MUN and then taking the onus to attend a workshop on how you MUN. This is the first step that you have taken, and hopeful that your experience will be brilliant. For everybody who is doing G20 here, we'll meet, we'll talk, and the human experience is the best experience that you can do in an MUN. And let's hope for a good time. Any questions that you guys might have, please raise your hand. Yeah, Aditi, please ask a question.
Being a beginner in an MUN, if I am allotted a not so good country which is not relevant to the agenda, so how should I stand out through my speeches and all?
Before I answer your question, Aditi, what is a not so good country? What do you mean by
the thing is,
yeah, tell me.
I think the country is not relevant to the it cannot contribute much to the solutions for the agenda.
Okay, fair. That's a very good answer. But at the end of the day, this is where a lot of you go wrong. Realize that when you are starting off, it's actually better for you to start off with something small. Okay. The first time I delegated as Sri Lanka. Okay. And I have only worked my way up from there. I now delegate only as the United States of America, and I don't take any other allotment until unless it's absolutely not there, because it's a sort of leveling up that I have done with respect to my understanding of everything and anything that is relevant to any sort of agenda which is being discussed. Okay, the reason or the primary reason as to why allotments are reserved, the P5 allotment necessarily are reserved, although I think this is a practice which needs to be completely abolished. If you're not in the UNSC, that is, if you're in any other committee, you should be allotted whatever you want. It should be a first come, first serve basis. But the reasoning why a lot of people feel that they have not been allotted a good country and it's not relevant to the overall global parity is because you don't understand something which is called proportionality. Okay. Now you need to understand that capacity of a country is dependent on a lot of factors, and those factors actually determine the amount of quantitative impact it has. But the qualitative impact of every country in any discussion or in the United Nations is resolved through one very simple way. Apart from the UNSC, in any other committee you go to, all countries have one vote, right? So at the end of the day, your opinion matters, your relevance in the committee, whatever you're speaking of, howsoever micro it can be. So what I think your understanding about is flawed is that you are maybe thinking the policy measures that you are suggesting, they might not have an impact compared to the policy measures that are being suggested by the country of the United States of America because of the capacity it has. But at the end of the day, you need to realize that when you are discussing something, howsoever micro it can be, and howsoever small scale it might be, it still is a measure that can be again converted into a module that other countries can use for their functioning. And even if you're suggesting something which is micro and only can be applied to a specific set of countries, a very niche set of countries, a niche set of issues, it's still a suggestion. And at the end of the day, you have one vote, and that's all that matters. So if your idea and if your understanding analysis is to the point, and if your persuasion, your negotiation is to the point, you can make ripples out of representing the smallest possible country as well. I'm speaking from personal experience. I have delegated myself once as countries like multiple times. I've delegated as Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. I've delegated as Cape Verde. But when you're a beginner, this might seem like a challenge, a task. A lot of resources might not be available to you as compared to a country which has a lot of resources available on the national websites. But at the end of the day, a starting point is a starting point, and you just build on your way accordingly. All right. So Aditi, just be cognizant of whatever you are reading on or reading up on, and just forget about the fact that your country is not relevant, because your country is relevant. Every country in the world is relevant to every socio-political global issue that is happening in any juncture on whatever level. And any sort of policy directive that you are mentioning, keeping your policy, foreign policy and national interest in mind, it will have relevance in the discussion in committee. Okay, so it's like a sort of reassurance that it does matter. All right. Okay, we'll take the next question, which is from Akshat.
Hi, so my question is kind of a follow-up to the previous question, but let's say if you're allotted a country which has been at the center stage of a lot of global events or dominates some kind of proceedings of the committee, how do you handle the flow then? How do you handle the situation then?
Brilliant question. If you're a beginner and let's say you have been allotted Israel in a discussion which is currently discussing the current conflict in the West Bank region, the onus is on you to read and understand. The reasoning as to why I built my way to the more preferential allotments that I now take up is because I needed, also I have been advised by my seniors who I look up to, that you need to firstly understand the issue and the situation from a neutral perspective before you look at the biased side of things. If at any point in time you're taking up a country which is in the center stage of a conflict, you need to be very sharp with respect to what the policy has been on that issue. At the end of the day, the people who make real-time policies, they are the ones who have the maximum amount of knowledge on the subject. Any country, any foreign policy advisor to any country, howsoever small that country is, has a minimum of 10 to 20 years of experience and a doctoral doctorate in the subject. All right. I have actually researched it. You can actually look it up as well. No country doesn't, like no country has a financial or let's say any sort of advisor that looks into the way it is represented in the global community who does not have a doctorate in the subject. So your understanding should be reminiscent of that person's understanding of it. And the only answer to this question is to just read and understand. Look at relevant resources and try to form your own analysis of it, as you will be in an MUN and as your executive board is not somebody who has a PhD in a certain issue, might be the case in certain simulations that you go to, but I certainly do not have a PhD in any subject as of now. So our understanding is also limited. So it's how you present your ideas as well. Okay. How you make them persuading enough for everybody to realize that at the end of the day, your understanding of this issue is the only correct understanding of the issue at hand. Okay. Even though rival country who might be arguing with you on a very regular basis, you need to ensure that your logic and your argumentation, your historical basis is to the point and solid. And the only advice for any situation like this, or for that matter, for any point in time like this, is to read and understand. That's all that matters. I hope that I've been able to answer your question, Akshat.
Yeah, and just one more thing about this. Let's say there are certain things that the country that we have been that we are representing has done, which are probably not in accordance at the with other countries. For example, they don't align with our thought process, and we might actually not have done the right thing. How do we defend that in that situation? I mean, do we take the same stance as the country stance and kind of be the bad person, or like how do we handle that? Just for some tips for that.
Again, a very brilliant question. Now, when you told me that your country might not have done the right thing, it's your understanding of the issue. It's not your country's understanding of it. It's how you look at it, how you take your own perspective and you take your own bias into understanding the issue. But there are, at the end of the day, the entire prospect of international relations and international governance is a gray area. So there is good and there is bad for whatever action which is being taken. It's your, it's your onus to ensure that whatever you are mentioning in the committee does not put you in a disadvantage with respect to the position that you're currently in. If you're saying, as China, that you have allowed information sharing, and if you have allowed transparent information sharing in a committee which deals with information sharing, you are going against your foreign policy. And that's a complete, hypocritical statement, and it's a redundant statement. It cannot be taken into accordance because China has always maintained complete opaqueness with respect to its information and its surveillance schemes as well. Okay, so it's about ensuring that your presentation of facts does not put you in a disadvantage from the status quo, and that's the only thing that matters. Again, your analysis is important, but what you think might be wrong, the head of state of your country does not think like that. Okay, so it's about role play. It's about, that's why a lot of people tend to only fix an allotment after 3-4 MUNs, because sometimes it's also about moral conscience to you. I have once tried to, the example that I took here, uh, I delegated once as Iran, and it was not a very positive experience for me with respect to my understanding of global issues at large. And then I've always stuck to countries of the Western thought with respect to UK, USA. Now I only delegate as USA. So having that understanding, that can only be done with experience, but that's the core idea of ensuring that whatever you are seeing is well thought of and logical and makes sense to everybody around you. You're not actually representing a country here. So at the end of the day, it should be in line with the real time, but your analysis is the most important aspect of it. I hope that answers your question. Guys, are there any other questions? I mean, even if it's a stupid question, please feel free to ask the question, because I think a lot of you have been here for the last 1.5 hours. I mean, thank you for being here in a meeting for 1.5 hours. if I was a participant, I would have logged off by now. I see a lot of people have logged off as well. But for the ones who have stayed here and listened to me, whatever I've said, if you have anything, a little bit of a scramble of a doubt in your mind, and if you're feeling a little bit underconfident, now is the time to ask a question. Okay? Yes, Devayush, please ask a question.
Hi, sir. So I had a simple query, as you stated about the taking the reports from international bodies or the international news forums. So organizations like Reuters are not considered by Russia, and if you talk about organizations like Al Jazeera, they're not considered by USA. So what news agencies do you suggest us to go with?
Don't go, don't look at any news agency for your, uh, you know, understanding of anything. If you're doing unbiased research, if just gain a sort of understanding as to what they show is through Wikipedia, then look at UN documents. Uh, a very credible. So there are a lot of other UN organizations which a sort of a lot of other countries don't recognize. With respect to the participation of China in HRC, the participation or the removal of Russia from UNHRC are very two good examples of the same. But at the end of the day, if you're taking up allotments like North Korea, Russia, China, at the end of the day, your analysis of reports will be different from somebody who is representing maybe a Scandinavian country or for that matter a European country. At the end of the day, it depends on your allotment, obviously, but the United Nations repository, the Dag Hammarskjöld library, is the best way for you to gain information. Your stance surrounding it depends on your portfolio. Okay, so for certain news agencies, when we started off, we were told that Reuters is the only acceptable source for news information and presenting in front of the in an email. But I am absolutely against that practice because certain countries, like you mentioned very correctly, Russia has failed, like it does not recognize Reuters as the correct source of information at any point in time, but it has its own policy considerations for the same, right? So the way you do it is firstly understand what your considerations are for if you're representing Russia in this case, and then you provide your understanding or own logic of it. But the UN repository, the UN library, the UN relevant UN documents, the relevant reports of specific international organizations, which are let's say discussion forums, these are important. Okay, your understanding of let's say the interpretation of the information depends on the allotment you have. All right. Hope that has been able to answer your question. All right. As I see your hand has been lowered. Yes, Devayush had another question. Organizers, please unmute Devayush. Yeah.
Yes, I had another query. So let's say I'm an UNHRC and the Israel-Palestine issue has been prevalent for a very long time. Let's say since the creation of the United Nations. And if we, since you talked about uh, referring to the old articles or the old resolutions of the UN, so when we look into that, isn't it like there are a lot of solutions which were proposed in the United Nations, of the various bodies of the United Nations, which have been rejected? So, won't that be, uh, won't that do justice to the individual or the country which is representing XYZ country?
Okay. If I understood your question correctly, your question is basically there have been a lot of times where let's say suggestions from the UN have been rejected. It's absolutely true. There
Just
at
like the
any
one state
point in
solution
time.
thing.
Yeah. So let's not go into the like so the technicalities surrounding the entire issue at hand. I do not want to help you with your committee because I am not somebody who is here to help you with your committee and your agenda. But at the end of the day, the approach or the general approach that I would ask you to take here is that you first need to realize that the United Nations has it is actually something which is it the purpose of the United Nations is to not ensure global peace, security, uh, although it might be on paper, but it's to ensure that the status quo does not change and it does not go for the worse. But it has, right? I mean, nothing in the world at any point in time, with respect to the Israel-Palestine issue, the idea of a one state, these ideas have been, rejected. The ideas of two-state solutions is also something which is being discussed. And there have been specific camps. The Camp David, for an example, is a very relevant camp, which the Oslo Accords. These very frameworks, these very documents are important. But these have also been rejected. So at the end of the day, like I mentioned previously as well, it's the information you gather from it. If, let's say, a set of measures have been already rejected, you need to firstly understand as to why they have been rejected. And when you gain that understanding, then you can analyze as to how these very measures can be better implemented given the time of implementation. Now, anything that you are stating as a measure needs to be relevant to the time you're simulating the committee in. And the information that you gather from the UN, past UN documents, past UN decisions is important only when and only for your understanding of the information in an unbiased manner. So there have been set of problems here. These are the solutions to the problem. Now you might argue, if you are delegating as Russia, if you're delegating as China, if you're even delegating as Israel, for that matter, even if let's say you are delegating as the representative of the PLO, the Palestine, that these measures have been made by people or made by individuals or made by the party which do not abide by my interests. Again, that is your understanding. That's your policy. And that is where the debate will happen. So exactly why I'm asking you to not look at media resources for your information. Your information should be only looking at UN websites or relevant bodies to the UN, relevant international organizations, not only UN organizations, but relevant organizations which has multiple membership. Okay, I'm not talking about specific media houses simply because the information there can be skewed, and that is the only reasoning behind having specific organizations and bodies, regional organizations for that matter. No matter what, those information can also be skewed from a Western perspective, maybe, or from a different perspective, maybe. But at the end of the day, arguing on these lines will only help you, or let's say the argumentation that you make, the rejections that you make, it's something that you will learn from at the end of the day. And when you're learning from these, you're presenting something new which does not overlap with the mistakes that you've made in the past. And it ensures that it's sort of a comprehensive way of looking at things in a much new manner. I hope that has been able to answer your question. A very lengthy answer I gave to this question, but this question was very interesting. So that's why I had to give such a lengthy answer. Yeah. Any other questions, guys? Any other questions? Again, I'm here with you for the next 10 minutes. I mean, I'm free for the next 10 minutes. So any sort of doubts, like I again mentioned, if you're feeling underconfident to speak up, take this as your first step for the MUN I'm going to attend in a few days. Yeah, Zahid, please ask your question. Zahid?
I wanted to ask if, hello?
Yeah, tell me.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you are audible.
Yes. So my query was, if you're supposed to look for the UN library for our research, and we are making a particular claim regarding a certain issue or a certain situation that has occurred in the past, then what are we supposed to state as our sources, if not Reuters or the trusted media houses?
National policy, national legislation, your understanding of your own national policy. It's very rare that somebody from the executive board or somebody from your committee will ask you as to what your sources are. If your statement in committee is relevant and is cognizant of your past measures, it will reflect the idea that your country has been trying to talk about. And if your understanding and your claims are even your own personal claims that you have understood and analyzed, it doesn't matter what your sources are. It just needs to be logical enough and sound enough, technical enough for the past, and he needs to be cognizant of the past, of the history of your country. That's all that matters. Was that understandable, Zahir?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. Guys, any other questions? Any other questions, guys? Yeah, Zahir, please ask another question, no worries.
Was by mistake, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. Anybody else who has any other questions to ask? Anything to say? Yeah, Srishti Soumya.
Hello.
Zahir, can you just lower your hand, please?
Any
Yeah, Srishti,
specific
please go ahead. Please go
any
ahead.
specific tips for those who are doing MUN for the first time?
The entire workshop was for you guys. There are no specific tips per se. Just try to keep these ideas in mind. Engage this as an exercise and not as your life if you start doing it. That's all that matters. Again, you have made a sort of a financial investment into this. You're investing your time, which is more important than the finances that have gone into it. Try to learn, but at the end of the day, just try to enjoy. If you're made for it, and if you think, just try to not stress yourself out. That's all that matters. Okay, just try to have fun from it and try to learn from it. It's not that deep. It's just something that you just engage in. It's an activity at the end of it. Okay, and try to keep. I mean, your question is actually very, very interesting because the entire presentation that I just made was for the exact question that you asked. So these are certain things that you can take note of if you have taken note of it. I'm hopeful that the organizers will be sharing the PDF with you as well, that you can go through it at your own time. Any other questions, guys? You know, it is quite depressing to just keep looking at your screen and seeing D, Z, JD, RG, just names on the screen. I am very keen on meeting every single one of you in the premises of IIT Kharagpur on Saturday and Sunday. I'm really very against online meetings, but as I was requested, I have agreed because I think it's important for everybody who is attending to have a good experience. So if you do not have any other questions to ask, you do not have anything to tell me, I'll be taking your leave and let's meet. Let's meet on Saturday. Let's have a good time and let's enjoy it. Try to, start doing your work from now itself. Again, the most important thing that I like to say, I might be sounding like a very Indian parent, but you have put your money in this, पैसा लगाया है, तो कुछ तो होगा, कुछ तो करना होगा. So do the same, have fun, don't stress yourself out. It's just a group of people meeting and discussing things, and yeah, have fun about it. If there's nothing else to ask, nothing else to add, thank you again for being here. Thank you all of you for sticking around till the end. I think around 31 of you are here. Yeah, thank you guys. Organizers, I think we can end the meeting if nobody else has anything to add.
Yeah. Thank you, Rupaz, for taking out the time for joining with us. Thank you, attendees. I hope you got a lot of insights from him. Looking forward to GMU in 2024, guys.